Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm proud to rise today on this important Opposition Day motion dealing with the interim measure, the preparatory step to the legalization promised by the current government in its election campaign, namely addressing the decriminalization of the possession of small quantities of marijuana. Madam Speaker, I wish to announce that I'll be sharing my time with the member for Salaberry-sur-Croix. Madam Speaker, we are faced with an injustice. We are faced with a situation that is difficult to explain to the parents of young adults. When I'm called by a mother in tears who says, my child has just been convicted of the possession of small quantities of marijuana, he or she will not be able to get a job because they will have a record and they'll be at the bottom of the pile when it comes to job applicants. They will no doubt be unable to travel to the United States. They face heavy consequences, including perhaps finding a place to rent when that is disclosed on their application. Meanwhile, we have the government saying that within a short period of time they will be bringing in measures, amendments presumably to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, that would put together a regime to regulate and to permit the adults to consume marijuana. Now, of course, we already have medical marijuana available thanks to the courts of the land and legislation and regulations that were brought in response to that. But we're talking about young people in particular, but all Canadians who wish to consume a substance that will be illegal. So what's the problem? The problem is it may take 2 years, Madam Speaker, for the government to implement the regime it promised in the October election. The Minister of Health, when she spoke in New York at the United Nations, said, quote, "It is impossible to arrest our way out of the problem," close quote. And of course she's right. But they're going to continue to arrest their way out of the problem for likely until 2018. If she promised that there would be legislation introduced in the spring of 2017, then it may be that that legislation, given the requirements of debate, committee work in both the House and the other place, it won't be implemented with signature of the Governor General until perhaps 2018. In that particular circumstance, Madam Speaker, something perhaps approaching 100,000 Canadians, should it take 2 years, will find themselves with a record for possession of small quantities of marijuana. Statistics Canada reports that something approaching 60,000 Canadians a year are going to be convicted for that offence, because it currently is an offence. The government would have you say, well, the law is the law is the law. And of course they're right on that, Madam Speaker. But what they don't tell you is that they have the ability under the law to address this injustice. And that ability can be found in any number of ways. Now, I'm not here to suggest the best way, but one way I will speak to, Madam Speaker. If they wished to address this as a preparatory step on their road to regulation and permitting the use of marijuana for recreational purposes, they have the ability under the Director of Public Prosecutions Act for the Attorney General, our Minister of Justice, to issue a directive to the Director of the Public Prosecutions Services to the effect that it is no longer in the public interest for small quantities of marijuana to be the subject of prosecutions. We're fortunate because that's quite readily done, Madam Speaker, because this particular substance, marijuana, is not regulated under the criminal code, which would engage all of the attorneys general and crown counsel across the land at the various provinces level. But no, it is dealt with under the Department of Justice through the DPP, the Public Prosecutions Service, so that it would be federal employees, crown counsel, who would be given that directive. And in that way, we could ensure that what I fear is a patchwork across the country is dealt with as well. When I say a patchwork, the situation at present is chaotic at best, Madam Speaker. I live in Victoria. The police have better things to do than to prosecute people for simple possession of marijuana in most circumstances. However, in the city of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, prosecution occurs much more readily. In the city of Kelowna, it occurs much more readily. We have a completely different regime in Canada, depending where you are, to address the possession of marijuana. As a Canadian, I find that offensive. We live in one country. Why is it that the law is so radically different in the real world, depending where you happen to be? That seems wrong. So that injustice can be dealt with quite readily, Madam Speaker, should the government wish to do so. I've suggested one technique by which it could be achieved, but there no doubt are other techniques open to the government that wish to say that. So they no longer can simply hide behind the veil that, oh, well, it's against the law is the law until it's changed. They have an interim way in which to change that law. There are preparatory steps along the way that would deal with the injustices. In addition, hundreds of thousands of Canadians have records, criminal records, for the possession of marijuana, going back often 20 years. That's wrong. The government could, as a consequential amendment, deal with that, and I hope that they do. But in the meantime, people's lives are being affected. People's lives are being affected by an injustice that could be addressed by this government, should it wish to do so. Now, Madam Speaker, it's important to recognize that that we are not advocating that marijuana be made available any more than the government is for young people. We want and respect the government's efforts to achieve a robust regulatory regime that keeps marijuana out of the hands of young people, children, and so forth. But we also want a regime where the injustices that are occurring now are addressed before we have to wait perhaps a year and a half or 2 years to address. And that is the reason for my motion today to address this problem. I think Canadians are expecting clarity from their government. And New Democrats believe it's irresponsible to allow valuable resources of police and courts to be wasted while a new criminal records created for something that will be perfectly legal. Now, Madam Speaker, I asked the Minister of Justice when she appeared before the Justice Committee to talk about this issue. It was reported that by the Public Prosecutions Service that the government plans to spend $3 to $4 million each year prosecuting simple possession of marijuana. That's money that could be spent doing things that Canadians need to be addressed in an urgent way. 2 or 3% of their whole budget, that includes terrorism, prosecution of drugs, criminal code, is being used for this purpose, according to the Director of Public Prosecutions. That's his evidence. Let me read to you, Madam Speaker, something that Justice Selkirk of the Ontario Court of Justice said in a case called Regina and Racine. He refused to accept a guilty plea for possession of marijuana. I'd like to read what the Honourable Justice said in court that day. I recall distinctly the Prime Minister in the House of Commons saying it's going to be legalized. I'm not going to be the last judge in this country to convict somebody of simple possession of marijuana. You can't have the Prime Minister announcing it's going to be legalized and then stand up and prosecute it. It just can't happen. It's a ludicrous, ludicrous situation. So I asked her, given those costs, would the government consider doing anything different? And the answer was vague to non-existent. So from a financial point of view, from the heavy hardship we're imposing, particularly on our younger population, and the member for Salaberry-sur-Loire will speak to that in greater detail, there's every reason to address this gap, and the excuses given by the government for not doing so simply do not hold water. There were, as I say, changes that could be made in the interim. And I want to end by saying, Madam Speaker, something that I said at the outset. The New Democratic Party agrees, like former Prime Minister Critic, that the time has come for decriminalization. We believe that there is every ability to fix this problem. It's a question of political will and sound public policy. To hide behind the status quo and do nothing is the government's particular option until they finally have a law enacted is not right, It creates a continuing injustice in this country, which is felt in different parts of the country in different ways. And we say on this side of the House that it's time to fix that problem now. Thank you.